So today I want to speak about slavery, specifically slavery in the Ottoman Empire. What was it like? What did it exist as? We've spoken a bit about slavery before. Specifically, if you've listened to my classes, you should know about the so-called devshirme. Devshirme means selection. It was a levy that the Ottoman state imposed upon Christian communities, predominantly in the Balkans. Um, through which male children were recruited, then sent to the capital, where they were put in Turkish farms to acculturate, and then after a year or two were tested for intelligence, etc. Those who were most capable became the chief administrators and raised and educated in the palace. Those less capable became soldiers, the elite soldiers, the janissaries, the new army of the Ottomans. And this continued basically between 1400 and about 1600. And as I pointed out before, essentially everyone during this period who was part of the ruling elite of the government came through the process of slavery. They were either picked up as children in this way, or they were the children of Byzantine noblemen or other slaves captured and then eventually brought into the palace, raised in the palace, and eventually transformed into the rulers. Of course, the Sultan was free, but everyone, the people serving him were technically slaves. As I pointed out in previous classes, this is not necessarily a giant innovation on the part of the Ottomans. The idea of the slave army had been around for many centuries, almost 1,000 years at this point. And even before the Ottomans, this was relatively common. Or before Islam, this was common even. The issue here is one of the things that the Ottomans did differently is that they took slaves from their own subject populations, which were technically not supposed to be enslaved. Now, as always, these children were manumitted, that is, released upon reaching adulthood, around the age of 20. But then they would continue to serve in the Ottoman government. And as far as we know, most continue to serve very faithfully. In fact, the Janissaries, the elite army raised from the Devshirme, were the only group to remain loyal to Sultan Bayezid when he faced Tamerlane in 1402 at the Battle of Ankara. Everyone else fled. So this, though, is only a portion, and it's important to keep in mind that this is not a gigantic number of people. Probably only, my guess is a few thousand children were taken every year. So over the course of time, of course, this adds up. But this is a minor drop compared to the overall numbers of slaves in general in the Ottoman Empire. And one of the things I want to talk about is what was the role of other slaves, normal slaves in sense, the ones that weren't destined to become elite soldiers or administrators. One thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the Devshirme system stopped around 1600. They stopped recruiting children that way. And they also needed space for all the freeborn Muslims who wanted to enter the government and to want to have a say in the affairs of the state. It could not continue in that fashion. That said, everyone who worked for the Sultan, even if they were freeborn, were still called kul, that is slaves, because basically the terminology carried over. There are some exceptions, as we spoke about, certain factions within the palace. For example, the eunuchs were always slaves, and there was white eunuchs and black eunuchs, depending on guarding different sections of the palace, responsible for different affairs in the dynasty. But also the women folk. The women continued to be recruited through slavery, and that includes the concubines who became the mothers of the sultans, and also all the servants and eunuchs and other people who worked in the harem. And of course, there would be slaves recruited into the elite households of major leaders as well. They would also have concubines and eunuchs, etc., as the sort of mirror image, or a smaller mirror image of the imperial household. Now, where would you find a slave it's actually, we know from court records and from other descriptions that there was significant slave markets, just like anywhere else in Europe, or basically anywhere else in the world at that point in time. Slavery was common. It was not unknown in any way. And it was consistently seen. So initially, remember, slaves are being captured by Ottoman raiders, et cetera, as they are raiding Balkan and European villages. In this case, taking captives from outside of the so-called realm of Islam, the Dar al-Islam, the realm of peace. They're taken from the realm of war, where it's legally permissible to capture people and enslave them. And this was, again, common practice, not just for the Ottomans or for any Muslim polity that was happening everywhere at all times. In fact, we know, for example, that the major slave merchants in the medieval Mediterranean were the Genoese, basically an Italian city-state. And they had trading colonies around the Black Sea and Mediterranean and were moving massive amounts of slaves. In fact, we know now, for example, it seems likely that the mother of Leonardo da Vinci was herself a slave from the Caucasus, brought over by Genovese merchants and eventually sold into a family, I guess in Florence or wherever it is that Leonardo da Vinci was raised. Now, if we were to look at actual depictions of slaves in the Ottoman records, though, we have very few. In fact, as far as I know, there are no actual visual depictions of slavery in the sense of people buying slaves. This is the closest one that I have found. It's from a costume album that was actually probably meant to, these were images created for guides for European diplomats coming to Constantinople. So probably it depicted different things that they were interested in Ottoman society. And because slavery was a common practice in Europe, they were also interested in what was the slave markets like in the Ottoman Empire. And here we can see, people basically inspecting slaves for physical quality, which you would look for as in defects, other things that would, of course, reduce the value of a slave as merchandise. And you can see here there's both slaves of African origin and of European or Middle Eastern origin. Here and here you see a person leading one way. Now, I think that probably this depiction is not original to the Ottoman visual tradition. In fact, probably that version here is a type that was probably created or was following models off of European depictions. In fact, here we see a slave market depicted in a costume album from an earlier period done by a European artist. So in all likelihood, the Ottomans themselves, or at least the Ottoman visual vocabulary, wasn't terribly interested in depicting slave markets. But here we see a kind of very similar scene, right? People inspecting women, grabbing their breasts and looking at their head, etc. That aside, where did slaves actually come from? The majority, again, are captured by raiders, both Ottoman and non-Ottoman, outside of the empire, right? So they're being captured on the steppes of around the Black Sea, so the Caucasus, what's today's southern Russia, Ukraine, etc. A lot of them are being captured in the process of war. Some people are being raided by, Tatars or by Cossacks and other people being captured during a raid in a village and then being sold on to various successive slave dealers. And if people had certain skills, tradespeople, musicians, etc., they could fetch a higher price and end up in a much better household. And as I pointed out, initially during the frontier period, when the Ottomans were raiding more commonly villages, etc., there was also slaves being brought forward from that process. Often a raider having captured, some people, 1 to probably 5, it's probably the max of how you could do, then had the choice of basically dragging the slaves back to a big city and trying to sell them, or selling them probably to the slave traders that followed the armies and the raiders and bought them at a relatively low price at the moment of capture. One reason why it was most likely that they were sold to slave traders right away is that they were then dependent, that the, let's say, the whoever had captured these slaves were needed to ensure the good health and condition of the slaves when they arrived back in the market. And this was hard when you had to then continue to march back thousands of kilometers to a big city where you could sell them for a higher price. Now, over time, based off of where the wars were occurring, different slaves came to different markets. So initially it was probably the frontier, the Balkans, then it moved more towards Russia, the Caucasus, and a lot of people were captured by pirates and all sorts of other people in the Mediterranean. And this applied, of course, both to Muslims and non-Muslims. Many Muslims were put into captivity by Christian pirates, etc., put into Malta and other places. Christians and others were put into captivity in Tunis and elsewhere. East African slaves mostly came from essentially the East Africa, would be today Sudan, where there's animist and Christian populations, Ethiopia, etc. If they were a eunuch, they would be then, to be a eunuch, they would be basically brought over to Egypt, somewhere in Upper Egypt, so what's called, I guess, would be Southern Egypt. They would be castrated. Those who survived would be then sold on as eunuchs. The castration would occur before the children reached puberty. And there was, again, both white and black eunuchs. Probably the slaves that had it the worst and had the most difficult life were galley slaves. So if you had no skills and if you were captured at sea, especially, and no one was going around to ransom you, which was the most often the case. Usually people were captured and then pirates would ransom the slaves while they waited essentially in these large dungeons with probably a few thousand people in them. Those dungeons occurred in Malta, in North Africa, and elsewhere, Italy, elsewhere. And you basically had to send someone out to go raise money and then hope that they would come back with that money to buy your freedom. Of course, oftentimes the person sent out, who was, again, another captive, sent out to raise money, would generally just run away or run away with the money, but many did come back with the amount of money they promised. Now, if you couldn't be ransomed, if you were not an important official or anything, or had specific skills, for example, if you were a villager living in a coastal place in Italy and you were captured by a sea raid by a pirate, then ultimately sold on, perhaps no one's ever going to come and get you, and you had no particular value. No one wanted slavery. You would end up as a galley slave. Galley slaves were basically rowers of the many ships in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean has inconsistent winds, and so therefore the best way to move around is in large boats rowed by oarsmen. Life on a galley would be difficult. Probably your life expectancy once is there would be a few years. You would basically just be forced to row all the time. And it wasn't a particularly glamorous life. But there was other forms of slavery. Many people were sold into other forms of labor, captive labor, essentially. Most clearly, you could buy a slave for domestic labor, help, and it's included for farms. We have, for example, in court records, examples of even farmers who basically had just some land, etc., owning a slave, which would probably be their most valuable property, and that was used for the work of running the farm. More skilled people, for example, if you were a weaver or an artisan, or etc., and this was again common, especially as people took boats to move around the Mediterranean, you could end up in a different type of labor contract. In fact, there was something called a mukatebe, which is basically a sort of indentured servitude contract, often done with skilled laborers. So, for example, if you knew how to build ships or if you were a weaver, you could end up in a place like Bursa or in the port of Constantinople, where someone would buy you and then contract with you to say that I'm going to pay you, you're going to get a wage from the material you produce as a weaver, et cetera. And they would set you up in a workshop. You pay me a set amount of money every month. And so it was a sort of investment that would eventually recoup the initial investment in the slave plus then some. Of course, women could also serve as concubines, and this was not, again, uncommon, though, again, having a concubine, especially one from, let's say, Russia or the Caucasus, was extremely expensive. This was not something that was commonly done. And as I pointed out, there's also governmental and elite slavery, people that were recruited to run the government, at least up until the 17th century. And finally, there were slaves taken, captives taken in order to ransom them, which was probably from the point of view of those doing the capturing, the most financially remunerative version. That said, I don't think we should overlook the fact that ultimately slavery was a form of exploitation. Slaves did not necessarily have the best of lives. Even though we know that, for example, it was common and in fact encouraged to free your slave after a set amount of years, especially for the death of the owner or on a big occasion like the circumcision of a son, etc. At that point, usually the slaves were still kind of dependents. They were still connected to the family. And in fact, if they had no other connections, I mean, if they were brought to a city where they knew no one, etc., often their connections with that family would be the only social connections they would have, and they would continue to be in some sort of clientage with that family, sometimes positively. For example, many merchants took on slaves who then served as agents in distant ports and then continued to serve as agents after being freed. Others would probably do so out of necessity. Slaves and former slaves were considered dependents. They were entitled to pieces of inheritance. In all likelihood, also the family would arrange for the marriages of the slaves and establish them within Ottoman society. So within a few generation, people were more or less integrated into the host society. Were children of slaves themselves? I think technically yes, but if they were children of the master, for example, there is a legal status called walad, the mother of a child. If a concubine, for example, gives birth to a child, a male heir, then not only is that child a legitimate heir, right, a legitimate son, but she's also supposed to be freed in that sense. So in most cases, slavery was not passed on through the generations in any way. And in fact, there wasn't really an attempt to do so. And as I pointed out, we shouldn't stop seeing this, though, as an exploitative form of labor. Different, though, from the type of slavery that came to predominate in the Americas. How was slavery different between the Ottoman Empire and the Americas? One, I think, obviously, the question here is one of plantation work and labor. In the Ottoman Empire, slaves were not used on plantations. Slavery, while common, was not often as, let's say, onerous or exploitative in that sense. And in fact, you don't have these gigantic slave societies with a small group of white owners and a larger group of African slaves. Ultimately, for example, in the Americas, slavery, the life of the African slaves was considered so cheap, it was often considered easier to basically work people to death, cheaper to work people to death than to keep them alive and to keep them healthy. And so you have this massive disregard for life. in the Americas that didn't exist in the Ottoman case. And ultimately, I think there's just a massive difference in numbers. I mean, millions of Africans were brought from different parts of Africa to the Americas, to Brazil, to the United States, the future United States, to the Caribbean and elsewhere. Whereas I don't think that the numbers were that high in the Ottoman Empire. And ultimately, I think we have to think about the concept of race here as a very clear and transformative technology of categorization. Race, while people noticed phenotypic differences between people's colors of skin and thought, that people from the Horn of Africa were different from sub-Saharan Africans, which are different from Russians, different from other people. They didn't formalize this into an entire system of human versus non-human. They were all humans, each with their different characteristic based off of climatic conditions. But there was no clear and transformative system of race in the way that that developed, at least in the 18th and 19th century Americas. Of course, race was also a different category earlier in the Americas in the 16th century and 17th century, where there's a lot more intermixing and transformation of populations throughout Central and South America and the Caribbean. So how should we actually define slavery, though? One scholar of slavery in the Ottoman Empire for the 19th century, Ehud Toledano, suggests that we should think of it as a continuum between servitude and freedom that defines slavery in the Ottoman Middle East. And I think this is helpful. And if we look at the other people who have written it, for example, Leslie Pierce, she also says it's a continuum of unfreedom, right? So there's basically people who are extreme elites who become essentially the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. And then there's people who are, galley slaves or concubines who are basically, or domestic slaves that are at the very bottom of this unfreedom and see many less benefits. Of course, as I pointed out, slaves could use the legal system. And in fact, we have numerous cases of slaves suing their owners for rights and freedoms and other things, even if they were obviously at a disadvantage in the legal system. I think one of the more interesting definitions of slavery, the traditional definition of slavery, is from the sociologist Orlando Patterson, who worked on slavery worldwide and throughout history, but I think predominantly in the Americas. He defines slavery through three conditions. One is this idea that slavery occurs through the commutation of death. The idea here is that when you are captured, you are being spared death, and therefore the life is in the hands of whoever captured you, and then eventually your master. So the slave becomes a slave, is enslaved by the act of avoiding death. But at the same time, there is a different form of death that is a social death. And I think this is the most important part here. Slaves were cut off from all connections to their former community when they entered as a slave in the place that they would end up, or at least the places that were held as slaves. They had no social connections. They weren't part of a larger kin group or a guild or even a religion, etc. initially. They really had only connections to the social order through their master. And it's their master that gives them power, that gives them status, that gives them any recognition in the society. And it's that same idea that, that ultimately that slaves cannot have honor because they're not a whole person. They cannot represent themselves. They only have power through the hands of another person. I do want to speak about the fact that it's not only slaves who were coming to the Ottoman Empire, but many Ottoman subjects were enslaved themselves. And in fact, if you were to look at, again, places like Livorno or Malta or other places, they were full of Muslims who had been captured at sea and sold into slavery. And in fact, there was large groups, large barracks of slaves, entire slave societies in parts of Italy. And there's even weird legal questions that arise. For example, what happens if you as an Ottoman subject own a slave, you're both captured at sea, Eventually, the owner is freed and ransomed, comes back to the Ottoman Empire. But the slave, he loses track of his slave. Eventually, that former slave goes on a ship, is captured again by pirates, and ends up as a slave back in, let's say, an Ottoman port like Izmir. Is that person still the slave of the original owner, or is the fact that they've been captured by Christian pirates, released, and then recaptured, make them break the bonds of slavery and of ownership? These all get into very complicated questions of international law, etc. All the things that Islamic law was able to kind of figure out in different ways. Now, the issue of slavery also became more central as the Ottomans began to lose territory and suffer somewhat significant defeats on their northern frontier, specifically against the Habsburgs, and then later on to the Russians. This started with a failed attempt to conquer Vienna in 1683. In the process, in the counterattack, the Ottoman armies were routed, and there was a major and destructive battle in which Buda was lost. The Ottoman armies regrouped and were defeated again at the Battle of Zenta in 1697, at which point, basically, it became clear that the Ottomans couldn't hold on to Hungary. The Habsburgs, under the prince called Eugene of Savoy, came and attacked and actually destroyed, for example, Sarajevo, sieged Serbia, etc. At different points, the Ottomans eventually retook Serbia and other parts, but they lost essentially Hungary and Transylvania. And that was formally ceded in this treaty, the Treaty of Karlovitz in 1699. And this was the first time the Ottoman Empire had formally ceded territory that it had held. And in fact, Hungary had been held by the Ottomans for about 150 years since the reign of Suleiman. You can read about the process of that slavery because as they captured that area, they took many Ottoman subjects as slaves, the Habsburgs, that is. And one of them, Osman of Timișoara is a city in Romania. He is initially a soldier. He works for the Ottomans, but as they are leaving, he's holed up in a city that is then captured by the Habsburgs. And he describes very vividly the process of that capture, right? They're under siege for many years and negotiate many months. They negotiate peace, which the Habsburgs kind of fail to really uphold. Basically, they allow people to leave with nothing on their backs. And you can see that the Muslim subjects have to exit the castle through this gauntlet, and as soldiers are grabbing women, cutting people's clothes off and tearing apart their bodies in search of gold and things like that they think that they're hiding. In the end, actually, even if they are allowed to escape, ultimately the Habsburgs just seize everyone and enslave them. And this guy, Osman, he's given to slave to various military commanders. He's exchanged between different people until he's eventually sold to a Habsburg general in Vienna. And there he serves in their household. He becomes a pastry chef, a very good one, and earns the trust of his host family, of his master. And remember, this is, you can imagine, a big household, probably not only the masters, but also probably 20 to 30 other dependents, people working in different ways from different parts of the Habsburg Empire, including 2 or 3 other Turkish or Ottoman slaves, including 1 or 2 women, etc. They eventually make a plan, even though the master likes him a lot, asks him to convert to Christianity, is willing to give him major positions, etc. He decides to give up this life and try to make an escape. So he teams up with the other woman and 2 other Ottoman subjects that they know from in Vienna, and they pretend to be merchants going down the Danube. They're trying to get towards the Ottoman border in Serbia, and they basically make it, but not until everyone cheats and betrays them along the way. One thing to think about, if you read, and you have a piece of this in your readings, but think about what kind of slavery does Osman experience? How does he narrate it? Does he want to be free or not? And ultimately, we should think about can we trust Osman's story? Ultimately, there's a bit of entertainment here. He writes this at the end of his life, at which he basically serves in different moments as after he's freed, he comes back to Istanbul, serves in different delegations. He's even asked to go back to the Habsburg lands and serve as an assistant to the diplomats, often at the request of the Habsburgs themselves, because he spoke fluent German, and he was a known quantity. And in fact, he's actually accused of being a Habsburg spy by some people. At the end of his life, living in Istanbul, he decides to write his memoirs, and this is what we have. They were not very popular. In fact, I think there's only one copy in existence, so this is not a popular type of genre. This is not a famous story in any ways. It's just an amazing story as one of the types of exchanges and visions of slavery and servitude that existed in the 17th century. Till next time, bye.